In the spring of 1861, along the muddy banks of the Mississippi River near Natchez, a woman named Sarah committed an act so horrifying that it would be whispered about in parlors and slave quarters alike for generations to come. 6 white overseers were found dismembered in the tobacco barns of the Ashford plantation, their bodies arranged in a manner that suggested not madness but calculated vengeance. The woman responsible had been considered the most docile, the most trusted, the most civilized of all the enslaved souls on that cursed land. This is her story, and the story of how slavery could transform even the gentlest heart into an instrument of unspeakable retribution. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten tales of the slave-holding South, stories that reveal the true cost of America's original sin. The Ashford plantation sprawled across nearly 800 acres of prime Mississippi bottomland, its fields thick with tobacco plants that swayed in the humid breeze like a green ocean of profit and suffering. Colonel Edmund Ashford, 47 years of age, had inherited the property from his father in 1855 and had expanded it considerably through shrewd investments and ruthless management. A graduate of the University of Virginia, Edmund fancied himself a gentleman scholar, a man who could quote Cicero while calculating the yield per acre of his cash crop. He kept a library of over 300 volumes in his manor house, a white column structure that overlooked the river with an air of classical permanence. He was known throughout Warren County as a fair master by the standards of the time, which is to say he whipped his slaves only when he deemed it necessary and provided them with adequate rations to keep them productive. He attended the First Presbyterian Church every Sunday with his wife Margaret, a pale, nervous woman of 39 who had given him 3 daughters but no sons, a failure that gnawed at Edmund's sense of dynasty and legacy. The plantation operated with approximately 230 enslaved men, women, and children, divided between field hands, house servants, and skilled laborers. Among them was Sarah, a woman of perhaps 35 years, though her exact age was unknown even to herself. She had been born on a cotton plantation in South Carolina and had been sold westward twice before arriving at Ashford at the age of 20. She was unusual in several respects. First, she could read and write, having been taught in secret by the daughter of her first master, a transgression that could have resulted in severe punishment had it been discovered. Second, she possessed what the white folks called a natural dignity, a quality that made her seem almost genteel despite her bondage. She moved with deliberate grace, spoke in measured tones, and had been assigned to work in the manor house as Margaret Ashford's personal attendant and seamstress. Third, and perhaps most significantly, she had developed an unexpected relationship with Colonel Ashford's prized stallion, Tempest, a magnificent black thoroughbred that Edmund valued at nearly $1,000. Tempest had been a wedding gift to Edmund from his father-in-law, and the colonel treated the horse with more affection than he showed his own wife. Every morning at dawn, Edmund would inspect the stables personally, running his hands along Tempest's flanks, checking his hooves, ensuring that his coat gleamed like polished obsidian. It was Sarah who had been given the responsibility of grooming Tempest, a task she performed with a devotion that bordered on religious. She would sing to the horse in a low, melodic voice, African spirituals mixed with English hymns, and Tempest would nuzzle against her shoulder with what appeared to be genuine affection. For Sarah, those hours in the stable represented the only moments of her life when she felt something approaching peace, when the weight of bondage lifted slightly and she could imagine herself as something other than property. The other key figures in this tragedy were the overseers, 6 men who managed the daily operations of the plantation under Edmund's supervision. There was Thomas Pickett, the head overseer, a brutal man of 42 with a scarred face and a reputation for excessive cruelty. Luther Crane, his deputy, 38 years old, who carried a leather whip coiled at his belt like a badge of office. Jacob Hayes, 29, a former sailor who had drifted inland seeking fortune and found employment terrorizing the enslaved. Samuel Drucker, 33, a German immigrant who spoke broken English but understood perfectly the language of violence. William Moss, 45, a failing farmer who had lost his land and now took out his bitterness on those even more powerless than himself. And finally, young Robert Ashford, Edmund's nephew, barely 21, who had come from Virginia to learn the plantation business and had quickly absorbed its worst lessons. These 6 men formed a brotherhood of sorts, united by their shared authority over black bodies and their mutual contempt for the humanity of those they controlled. The spring of 1861 was a time of tremendous upheaval. South Carolina had seceded from the Union in December of the previous year, and Mississippi had followed in January. War fever gripped the South, and young men were enlisting in Confederate regiments with romantic visions of glory and the preservation of their way of life. Colonel Ashford, too old for active service but wealthy enough to matter, had contributed significant funds to the war effort and had promised to send cotton and tobacco to support the troops. The plantation was operating at maximum capacity, the enslaved population driven harder than ever to meet the increased demands. Tensions were high, tempers short, and the overseers wielded their authority with even less restraint than usual. It was on the morning of April 14, 1861, 2 days after the bombardment of Fort Sumter, that the incident occurred. Colonel Ashford had ridden into Natchez on business, leaving the plantation in the hands of Thomas Pickett and his fellow overseer. The men had been drinking the night before, celebrating the outbreak of war with whiskey and crude songs about putting Yankees in their place. They woke late, irritable and hungover, and found themselves in a foul mood as they surveyed the fields. A section of tobacco plants had been damaged by an unseasonable frost, and Pickett decided that someone must be blamed. He selected 3 field hands at random and had them whipped in front of the others as an example, a common practice meant to instill fear and maintain control. But the whipping was not enough to satisfy Pickett's anger. He noticed that Tempest's stable door had been left slightly ajar, a minor oversight that would normally warrant only a reprimand. But Pickett saw an opportunity for sport. He gathered the other 5 overseers and proposed a cruel entertainment. They would discipline the horse as a lesson about negligence. What followed was an act of such pointless brutality that it defied explanation even by the degraded standards of the institution that enabled it. The 6 men entered the stable with knives and branding irons heated in a nearby forge. They forced Sarah to watch as they mutilated Tempest, cutting off portions of his ears, burning symbols into his flanks, and finally hamstringing the magnificent animal so that he collapsed onto the stable floor, unable to stand, his eyes rolling in agony and confusion. Sarah did not scream. She did not weep. She stood perfectly still, her face a mask of stone, as the overseers laughed and congratulated themselves on their morning's work. When they finally left, still chuckling about the colonel's reaction when he returned, Sarah remained in the stable with the dying horse. She knelt beside Tempest, placed her hand on his trembling neck, and whispered words that no one else would ever hear. The horse died within the hour, and Sarah covered his body with clean straw, performing a ritual of respect that the animal's own master would never know about. Pause for a moment and reflect. In a system that reduced human beings to the status of livestock, what happened when even the livestock were treated with more casual cruelty than the daily degradations of slavery required? What darkness must have lived in the hearts of men who would torture an innocent animal simply because they had the power to do so, and because they knew no punishment would follow? Colonel Ashford returned that evening to find his beloved Tempest dead. His rage was immediate and volcanic. He stormed through the house, overturning furniture and shouting for explanations. When Thomas Pickett finally confessed what had been done, expecting perhaps a mild rebuke, Edmund struck him across the face with his riding crop and fired all 6 overseers on the spot. But the damage was done, and Edmund knew it. Tempest could not be restored. His grief was genuine, perhaps the only genuine emotion he had felt in years, and it mixed with a sense of betrayal that his own employees would destroy something he cherished. He retreated to his library with a bottle of bourbon and did not emerge until the following day. Sarah, meanwhile, had been sent back to the slave quarters, her duties temporarily suspended while Margaret Ashford tended to her husband's melancholy. In the windowless cabin she shared with 3 other women, Sarah sat on the edge of her wooden bunk and felt something break inside herself, some final barrier between civilization and the savage justice that slavery itself had taught her. She had endured 20 years of bondage with what might be called grace, maintaining her dignity and her secret literacy, nurturing small hopes for a future that might never come. But the murder of Tempest had been different. The horse had been innocent in a way that even she, as an enslaved woman, could not claim to be. Tempest had not chosen to be born, had not sinned, had not transgressed any law human or divine. His only crime had been to be valuable to a man who owned both horses and humans, and therefore to become a target for other men who resented that ownership. What Sarah decided in those dark hours remains a matter of speculation and horror. She did not speak of it to her cabin mates. She did not confide in the preacher who led prayers on Sunday evenings. She moved through the next 3 days like a ghost, performing her duties mechanically when they were restored to her, speaking only when spoken to, her eyes distant and strange. Those who knew her noticed the change, but attributed it to grief or shock. No one suspected that behind her blank expression, Sarah was planning an act of retribution so complete and so terrible that it would haunt the collective memory of Mississippi for decades to come. The 6 former overseers had not left the plantation immediately. Colonel Ashford, his anger cooled somewhat by bourbon and the realization that finding replacements during wartime would be difficult, had rescinded his dismissal and placed the men on probation. They were to sleep in the tobacco barns for 1 week as punishment, denied access to their usual quarters, and then would be reinstated if they demonstrated proper contrition. It was a humiliation for white men to be treated thus, sleeping among the curing leaves like common laborers, but they accepted it rather than face unemployment in a region preparing for war. They gathered each night in the largest barn, playing cards by lamplight and grumbling about the injustice of being punished for what they considered a mere prank. If you find yourself drawn to these forgotten chronicles of America's darkest chapter, consider subscribing to Shadows of the South. Each week we bring you meticulously researched accounts of the true stories that textbooks prefer to omit, the human dramas that reveal the psychological and moral devastation wrought by the institution of slavery. Join us as we refuse to let these voices be silenced by time. On the night of April 18, 1861, Sarah entered the tobacco barn. The moon was new, and the darkness was absolute beyond the feeble glow of the overseer's lamp. She carried with her a canvas sack that clinked softly as she walked, and her movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if she were performing a sacred duty rather than approaching an act of violence. The men were drowsy, half drunk on confiscated wine, their guard lowered by the assumption that no enslaved person would dare to harm them. Sarah had brought them a gift, she said, a peace offering from the house slaves who wished to see them restored to the colonel's good graces. It was a large pot of stew, still warm, seasoned with herbs from Margaret Ashford's garden. The men accepted it eagerly, spooning the thick mixture into their mouths and complimenting Sarah on her cooking skills. What they did not know was that Sarah had laced the stew with a powerful sedative derived from jimsonweed and laudanum, substances she had acquired over months of careful hoarding from the manor house medicine cabinet. Within 20 minutes, all 6 men were unconscious, sprawled across the barn floor in postures of grotesque vulnerability. Sarah stood over them, the lamp casting her shadow enormous against the barn wall, and she began her work. The details of what followed were reconstructed later from the physical evidence, and they remain almost too horrifying to contemplate. Sarah had brought with her the tools of her trade as a seamstress, sharp shears, curved needles, strong thread, and various blades used for cutting leather and cloth. She had also taken from the plantation's toolshed a meat cleaver, several saws, and a collection of butcher's implements normally used for slaughtering hogs. Over the course of what must have been 4 or 5 hours, working with the methodical precision of a craftsman, Sarah dismembered the 6 unconscious men. She began with Thomas Pickett, the head overseer, severing his limbs at the joints with a combination of knife-work and sawing, the sounds muffled by the thick tobacco leaves hanging from the rafters. She moved to Luther Crane, then Jacob Hayes, then Samuel Drucker, then William Moss, and finally to young Robert Ashford, each man receiving the same treatment. The most disturbing aspect of the scene discovered the next morning was not the dismemberment itself, though that was horrific enough, but the arrangement of the bodies. Sarah had positioned the severed limbs and torsos in a circular pattern around the barn's center, with the heads placed in the middle facing outward, as if the dead men were witnessing their own destruction. She had used her seamstress's thread to stitch certain body parts together in ways that suggested a deliberate symbolic meaning, though exactly what she intended to communicate was never fully understood. Some who saw the scene claimed it resembled African religious iconography, a ritual of justice from a tradition older than slavery itself. Others insisted it was simply madness, the snapping of a mind broken by years of oppression. But those who knew Sarah, who remembered her dignity and her intelligence, believed it was neither madness nor ritual, but rather a carefully constructed message, that she could reduce her oppressors to pieces just as they had reduced her to property, that she could exercise the same arbitrary power over their bodies that they had exercised over hers, and that she would make them understand, even in death, what it meant to be utterly helpless before another's will. Sarah did not attempt to flee. When the barn was discovered at dawn by a house servant, bringing breakfast to the overseers, and when the screams brought Colonel Ashford and a dozen armed men running from the manor house, they found Sarah sitting calmly outside the barn door, her hands and dress soaked in blood, staring at the rising sun with an expression of profound tranquility. She offered no resistance when they seized her. She spoke no words in her defense. She simply looked at Colonel Ashford with eyes that seemed to see through him to something beyond, and in that gaze he reportedly saw such depth of accusation that he turned away and could not meet her eyes again. In a society where even love was considered property, and where the most intimate human connections could be bought and sold, is it any wonder that the ultimate expression of resistance would take a form so absolute and so terrible? Pause and consider what it means to live in a world where your only power is the power to destroy, where the only justice available is the justice you carve from the bodies of your torturers. The aftermath of Sarah's act unfolded with the grim inevitability of Greek tragedy. There was never any question of a trial. Under Mississippi law, an enslaved person who killed a white person was subject to immediate execution, and the killing of 6 white men, even if they were only overseers and not proper gentlemen, demanded swift and public retribution. Colonel Ashford, devastated by the loss of his nephew and shaken by the horror of the scene in the tobacco barn, nevertheless insisted on a measure of formality. He convened a gathering of neighboring planters and the county sheriff to determine the method of execution. Some argued for burning, the traditional punishment for slave rebellion. Others suggested drawing and quartering to match the crime. But Edmund, in what might have been his last gesture toward the civilized values he claimed to represent, insisted on hanging, to be carried out within 24 hours. The execution took place on April 20th, 1861, in the clearing between the manor house and the slave quarters, in full view of the plantation's entire population, both white and black. A makeshift gallows was erected from lumber taken from the tobacco barn, a final irony that no one commented upon. Sarah was brought from the locked cellar where she had been held, her hands bound with rope, her blood-stained dress still unwashed. She walked to the gallows with the same deliberate grace she had always possessed, her head held high, her face serene. The plantation's Methodist preacher, a nervous young man named Reverend Caldwell, who served both the white family and the enslaved population, attempted to offer Sarah last rites and to extract a confession that might save her immortal soul. She looked at him with something like pity, and spoke her only recorded words since the killings. "Tell them that Tempest was innocent, and so was I, and so were all of us. Tell them that they created this." The hanging was bungled, as such crude executions often were. The drop was too short, the rope too long, and Sarah did not die instantly, but strangled slowly, over the course of several minutes, while the assembled crowd watched in various states of horror, satisfaction, or numb shock. Colonel Ashford turned away before she stopped moving. Margaret Ashford fainted and had to be carried back to the house by her daughters. The enslaved witnesses stood in absolute silence, forbidden to speak or weep, but their faces told a story that no white person wanted to read. This could be any of us, their expressions said, and perhaps in their darkest hearts, perhaps it should be. Sarah's body was not buried in the slave cemetery, but was instead burned and her ashes scattered in the river, an attempt to erase her from the physical world, as completely as her existence had been erased from the moral consideration of the society that enslaved her. But erasure is never complete, and memory has its own justice. The tobacco barn was dismantled within a week, its lumber buried in a pit, and a new barn constructed on a different part of the plantation. The Ashford plantation continued to operate throughout the Civil War, though with constant difficulty finding overseers willing to work there once the story spread. Local slaves spoke of Sarah in whispers, some calling her a saint, others a demon, most simply calling her by her name with a reverence that suggested she had transcended the categories their oppressors had created for her. Colonel Edmund Ashford lived until 1867, surviving the war but not its aftermath. His plantation was eventually confiscated during Reconstruction, and he died a bitter, broken man in a boarding house in Vicksburg, having lost everything except his memories and his guilt. Margaret Ashford survived him by 3 years, living with one of her daughters in Mobile, and was said to wake screaming in the night, haunted by dreams of a woman, with blood-stained hands standing at the foot of her bed. Of their 3 daughters, one never married, one married a northern carpetbagger, and was disowned, and one drank herself to death before the age of 40. The family name, once prominent in Mississippi society, disappeared from the rolls of the respectable within a generation. The 6 overseers were buried in a mass grave in the Natchez City Cemetery, their names inscribed on a single stone that made no mention of how they died, only that they were faithful servants of their employer. No one tended the grave after the first year, and eventually the stone itself was swallowed by weeds and forgotten. Their families, such as they had, scattered to other states, unwilling to remain in a place where they would forever be associated with the massacre in the tobacco barn. But the question that haunted the white community of Warren County for years afterward was not about the overseers or their fate, it was about Sarah herself. How had a woman, enslaved for nearly 2 decades, a woman known for her gentleness and her civilized manner, a woman who sang hymns and could quote scripture, become capable of such calculated butchery? The answer, which they could never quite bring themselves to acknowledge, was that Sarah had learned everything she knew about violence from the system that enslaved her. She had spent 20 years watching human beings treated as livestock, watching bodies broken and spirits crushed, watching arbitrary power exercised without mercy or accountability. She had internalized the central lesson of slavery, that those with power can do absolutely anything to those without it, and that the only morality that matters is the morality of force. When she finally acted, she was not rejecting the values of the slave society, she was embodying them completely, turning the master's tools against the master's servants with a precision that revealed just how thoroughly she had understood the nature of the world she inhabited. Reflect, if you will, on the bitter irony at the heart of this tragedy. The slave-holding South prided itself on its civilization, its Christianity, its codes of honor and chivalry, yet it created a system so fundamentally corrupt, so thoroughly based on the denial of human dignity, that it transformed both the enslaved and the enslavers into something less than fully human. The overseers who mutilated an innocent horse for sport were not monsters from some distant barbaric past, they were ordinary men. White men, Christian men, who had been granted absolute power over other human beings, and had discovered that such power inevitably corrupts those who wield it. And Sarah, who might in a just world have lived a life of quiet dignity and simple pleasures,
was instead forged into an instrument of vengeance by the very system that claimed to have civilized her. The story of Sarah and the 6 overseers is not simply a tale of individual madness or exceptional brutality. It is a window into the psychological and moral devastation that slavery inflicted on everyone it touched. It reveals how the institutionalized violence of human bondage created a world where the most horrific acts became possible, even inevitable, because the fundamental premise of the society was itself an act of ongoing horror. Every day, millions of human beings were held in chains, their bodies exploited, their families torn apart, their very humanity denied by law and custom and scripture. In such a world, the murder of 6 white men by an enslaved woman was not an aberration, but a logical outcome, a mathematical inevitability in a system built on force and fear, and the absolute dehumanization of an entire race of people. The legacy of that system extends far beyond the graves of Sarah and her victims. It lives on in the trauma passed down through generations of African Americans, in the economic disparities that trace their roots directly to slavery and its aftermath, in the racial tensions that continue to divide this nation more than a century and a half after the 13th Amendment supposedly ended human bondage in America. The tobacco fields of the Ashford plantation are long gone now, returned to forest or developed into suburban homes, where families live in complete ignorance of the blood that once soaked that soil. But the history is still there, waiting to be acknowledged, demanding to be remembered, insisting that we reckon with what was done and what was allowed, and what it cost in human suffering. Sarah's story was never recorded in the official histories of Mississippi or the Civil War. Her name does not appear in the county records beyond a brief notation of her execution. She has no grave, no monument, no place in the public memory of her time and place. But her act of terrible vengeance echoes across the years as a testament to the reality of slavery, a reality that no amount of lost cause mythology or romantic nostalgia for the Old South can erase. She was not a hero, and what she did was not justice in any conventional sense, but she was a human being pushed beyond the limits of human endurance by a system designed to break her, and in her breaking, she revealed the truth that her oppressors most feared, that the enslaved were fully human, capable of rage and calculation, and the kind of violence that only equals can inflict upon each other. These stories, uncomfortable as they are, reveal the true price of power, built on the enslavement of others, and the cost of a moral silence that allowed such an institution to flourish for more than 2 centuries on American soil. The tobacco barn is gone, the plantation dispersed, the participants all long dead. But the questions Sarah's act raised remain unanswered. What does it do to a society to base its prosperity on the absolute subjugation of millions? What does it do to the human soul to live in such a society, whether as master or slave? And what debts do we still owe to those whose suffering we have tried so hard to forget? If this exploration into the darkest corners of American history has moved you to think differently about the past and its lingering presence in our contemporary world, I invite you to share your reflections in the comments below, and to remember that the stories we choose to tell about our history shape the future we create.